Sometimes a man chooses loneliness because it's easier than risking his heart again. Jacob Stone learned that lesson the hard way 15 years ago in the Colorado mountains. He built his cabin far from civilization, where the only sounds were wind through pine trees and his own footsteps. Then came the poker game that changed everything. He won a woman named Ruby Mae, a saloon girl with fire in her eyes and secrets in her past. When a brutal winter storm traps them together, they discover that surviving the wilderness is nothing compared to surviving each other. For 2 years, they fight, they clash, and slowly something deeper begins to grow. What happens when two wounded souls find that love might be worth the risk? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the valley like a gentle shroud, and Jacob Stone emerged from his cabin as he had every dawn for the past 15 years. His boots crunched against the frost-covered pine needles, a sound that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. The air bit sharp and clean in his lungs, carrying the scent of evergreen and the promise of winter's early arrival. At 42, Jacob possessed the lean, weathered frame of a man who had learned to live with the land rather than against it. His dark hair showed silver at the temples now, and deep lines marked the corners of his grey eyes, lines carved by squinting into mountain sunrises and the weight of memories he'd carried too long. His hands, scarred from countless encounters with axe and knife, moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who had reduced life to its essentials: shelter, food, survival, and the blessed silence that came with solitude. The cabin stood like a testament to his determination to live apart from the world. Built from lodgepole pines, he'd felled himself, chinked with mud and moss. It was sturdy enough to withstand the brutal Colorado winters, yet humble enough to blend into the landscape. Inside, everything served a purpose. His bed occupied one corner, covered with heavy wool blankets and bear pelts. A stone fireplace dominated the center wall, flanked by shelves holding his modest collection of books, mostly practical volumes on hunting, trapping, and wilderness survival, though a well-worn copy of Shakespeare's sonnets lay hidden beneath them. The single room contained a handmade table, 2 chairs he'd crafted during a particularly long winter, and little else in the way of comfort. Jacob had built this life deliberately sparse, stripping away everything that might remind him of the man he'd once been, the life he'd lost, the love that had taught him that sometimes the heart could break so completely that a man needed mountains and years of silence to make it whole again. His morning routine never varied. Coffee first, black and strong, brewed over the coals of the banked fire. Then a survey of the property, checking the small corral where his horse, Thunder, waited for his daily grain. The mare was getting old like him, her coat now more grey than black, but she remained steady and sure-footed on the treacherous mountain paths. She nickered softly at his approach, and he ran a gentle hand along her neck before filling her feed bucket. Next came the inspection of his trap lines. Autumn was prime season for beaver and marten, and the pelts would provide the currency he needed for his twice-yearly trips to Bent Creek, the small settlement 50 miles down the mountain. These expeditions were necessary evils, chances to trade furs for supplies, ammunition, and the few provisions he couldn't hunt or grow himself. He spoke to no one longer than required for business, ignored the curious glances and whispered speculation about the hermit from the high country, and returned to his sanctuary as quickly as possible. Today's trap check yielded 2 fine beaver pelts and a marten whose rich brown fur would fetch a good price. Jacob reset the traps with the methodical care of long practice, then headed back toward the cabin. The pile of furs in his root cellar was growing substantial. Soon, he'd need to make the journey to town, a thought that brought its familiar weight of reluctance. He was splitting kindling behind the cabin when Thunder's whinny made him look up. Someone was coming up the narrow trail that served as the only approach to his property. Jacob straightened, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle that never strayed far from his side. Visitors were rare and usually unwelcome. Most who found their way to his remote cabin were either lost or running from something. The rider who emerged from the tree line was neither what he expected nor prepared for. She sat astride a bay gelding with the easy grace of someone comfortable in the saddle, but everything else about her presence struck him as incongruous against the wild backdrop of his mountain home. Her dress, though travel-stained and worn, had once been fine, deep blue silk with elaborate buttons that caught the morning light. Her hair, a rich auburn that gleamed with copper highlights, was pinned up in a style that belonged in a parlor, not on a mountain trail. But it was her eyes that held him. Green as spring pine needles, they regarded him with a mixture of wariness and determination that spoke of someone accustomed to sizing up situations quickly and making decisions that mattered. She looked to be perhaps 28 or 30, with the kind of beauty that made men do foolish things. But there was something else there, an intelligence and strength that suggested she was far more than ornamental. "You would be Jacob Stone," she said, and her voice carried the cultured tones of someone with education, though underneath lay a harder edge that told of experience with the rougher side of life. "I would be," he replied carefully, "though I can't say I was expecting company." She dismounted with fluid grace, then reached into her saddlebags to withdraw a folded paper. "I have something that belongs to you, or rather, something you won fair and square 3 nights ago in Charlie Morrison's poker game." Jacob frowned, trying to place the reference. He'd been to Bent Creek recently, but he rarely stayed long enough for card games. And he certainly couldn't recall winning anything worth a woman's journey up his mountain. "I think you have me confused with someone else." "Miss Ruby Mae Sinclair," she said, then added with a bitter smile, "though most folks in Bent Creek know me by my working name. Ruby Red. They call me at the Silver Dollar Saloon." She held out the paper. "This is a bill of sale, properly witnessed and signed. Charlie Morrison had to settle a debt, and I was part of the collateral. Congratulations, Mr. Stone, you now own me." The words hit him like a physical blow. Jacob stared at the document without taking it, his mind struggling to process what she was saying. He had gone to town, that much was true. He'd traded his furs and restocked his supplies. There had been an evening at the saloon, not for the women, but because it was the only place in town that served a decent meal. He remembered Charlie Morrison, the saloon owner, desperately trying to cover a bet in a high-stakes game. There had been talk of collateral, of unusual stakes, but Jacob had been focused on his whiskey and his food, eager to complete his business and return to the mountain. "I don't own people," he said finally, his voice rough with shock and growing anger. "Tell that to Charlie Morrison and his creditors," Ruby Mae replied. "The law says different. Bill of sale transfers ownership of one Ruby Mae Sinclair to one Jacob Stone of Pine Creek Valley in consideration of debts paid and services rendered." She folded the paper and tucked it back into her saddlebag. "I didn't come here because I wanted to, Mr. Stone. I came because I had no choice." Jacob's mind reeled. The very idea of owning another human being was abhorrent to him, a notion that went against everything he believed. Yet here stood this woman, claiming he'd somehow become responsible for her fate through a poker game he barely remembered. "This is madness," he said. "You can't be serious." "Serious as a hanging judge," Ruby Mae replied. Charlie needed to cover his bet or face some very unpleasant consequences from men who don't accept excuses. "You were there, you had the winning hand, and when the pot came up short, you agreed to take additional collateral." She gestured to herself with a theatrical flourish that didn't quite hide the pain beneath. "Congratulations. You're now the owner of one slightly used saloon girl, complete with an attitude problem and a past that would make a preacher blush." The autumn wind picked up, rustling the aspens and sending a chill through the air that had nothing to do with temperature. Jacob stared at this unexpected complication to his carefully ordered life, trying to find words for a situation that defied all logic and decency. "I'll take you back to town," he said finally. "We'll sort this out with Morrison." Ruby Mae laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Charlie's already headed for California with what money he could scrape together. The Silver Dollar's closed, and half the men in town are looking for him. Even if we could find him, the debt's been settled legal and proper. I'm afraid you're stuck with me, Mr. Stone. She turned away from him then, leading her horse toward the small corral where Thunder watched with mild interest. I don't suppose you have any objection to me putting my horse up for the night? It's been a long ride, and Belle here could use some grain and rest. Jacob watched her move with the confident efficiency of someone accustomed to taking care of herself, and felt his world tilting off its axis. For 15 years, he'd built his life around solitude and simplicity. Now in the space of a few minutes, everything had become impossibly complicated. "Miss Sinclair," he began. "Ruby Mae," she corrected, unsaddling her horse with practiced ease. "If we're going to be sharing accommodations, we might as well dispense with the formalities." Sharing accommodations. The words sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the approaching winter. Jacob looked at his small cabin, built for one person's simple needs. Then at the woman who was calmly settling her horse as if she belonged here. "You can't stay here," he said. Ruby Mae paused in her work and gave him a look that was equal parts amusement and challenge. "Where exactly do you suggest I go, Mr. Stone?" "It's a 50-mile ride to the nearest settlement. Winter's coming early this year by all signs, and I have exactly $3.47 to my name," she resumed, brushing down her horse. "I'm afraid you're stuck with me until spring, at the very least." Spring. The word echoed in Jacob's mind like a death sentence. 6 months, maybe more, sharing his sanctuary with this green-eyed disruption to everything he'd built his life around. He found himself studying her profile as she worked, noting the determined set of her jaw, the way her hands moved with gentle competence over her horse's coat. There was more to Ruby Mae Sinclair than met the eye, that much was clear. The question was whether his carefully constructed world could survive her presence long enough to find out what. As if sensing his scrutiny, she turned to face him fully. "I know this isn't what either of us wanted, Mr. Stone, but sometimes life deals us a hand we never asked for, and we have to play it as best we can." Her green eyes held his steadily. "I'm willing to earn my keep. I can cook, clean, mend, and I'm not afraid of hard work. All I ask is a roof over my head and enough food to survive the winter." Jacob nodded slowly, though every instinct screamed at him to saddle Thunder and escort her back down the mountain immediately. But the rational part of his mind recognized the truth of her situation. Winter came hard and fast in the high country. The nearest town was a dangerous journey in good weather, potentially lethal once the snow began to fly. Whatever complications her presence might bring, he couldn't send her to her death. "You can use the loft," he said finally. "There's a ladder in the cabin, and I can rig up some blankets for privacy." Ruby Mae's smile was the first genuine expression he'd seen from her since her arrival. "Thank you, Mr. Stone. I promise I won't be more trouble than necessary." As she led her horse into the corral beside Thunder, Jacob wondered if she had any idea how impossible that promise was to keep. His life had just become infinitely more complicated, and he had the unsettling feeling that Ruby Mae Sinclair was going to turn his carefully ordered world upside down in ways he couldn't even imagine. The first fat snowflakes began to fall as they walked toward the cabin together, and Jacob realized with a mixture of dread and something else he didn't want to examine too closely that this was only the beginning. The snowflakes that had begun falling so gently the evening before transformed overnight into something far more ominous. Jacob woke to a silence so complete it made his ears ring, the peculiar quiet that came only when snow fell thick and heavy, muffling every sound in the world. He rose from his bed and moved to the single window, peering through glass already frosted with ice crystals. What he saw made his blood run cold. The storm had intensified beyond anything he'd expected, even for these mountains known for their sudden and violent weather changes. Snow fell in sheets so dense he could barely make out the corral 20 yards away. The wind howled like a living thing, driving the snow horizontal and piling it in drifts that were already knee-deep and rising fast. This wasn't just an early winter storm. This was a blizzard of the kind that came perhaps once in a decade, the sort that could bury a man's cabin and leave him trapped for weeks or even months. Above him, in the loft, he heard Ruby Mae stirring. She'd been surprisingly quiet the evening before, accepting the simple meal of venison stew and cornbread he'd prepared, helping with the dishes without being asked, and retiring early to the makeshift sleeping area he'd arranged among the rafters. He'd barely slept, hyper-aware of her presence above him, the soft sounds of her breathing, the way her weight on the floorboards changed the familiar creaks and settles of his cabin. "Mr. Stone." Her voice drifted down from the loft, and he heard the ladder creak as she descended. "Is that wind as bad as it sounds?" Jacob turned from the window to find her standing near the fireplace. Having descended so quietly, he hadn't heard her footsteps. She wore a simple grey dress this morning, her auburn hair braided down her back, and her green eyes were alert with concern. "Worse," he said grimly. "This is what we call a killer storm. Came in faster and harder than any weather I've seen in years." Ruby Mae moved to the window and peered out, her face paling as she took in the whiteout conditions. "How long will it last?" "Could be days. Could be weeks." Jacob moved to the fireplace and began building up the fire from the banked coals. "Storm like this, there's no predicting. But one thing's certain. Nobody's traveling anywhere until it blows itself out." He saw her shoulders tense, and when she turned from the window, her face had gone carefully blank, the practiced expression of someone who'd learned to hide her thoughts and feelings as a matter of survival. "I see," she said quietly. "So we're trapped here together." "Looks that way." Jacob fed another log to the fire, avoiding her gaze. "I've got supplies enough for the winter, but they were calculated for one person, not two. I can eat less." "No." The word came out sharper than he'd intended. "I won't have anyone going hungry under my roof." "We'll manage." Ruby Mae was quiet for a long moment, and when he looked up, he found her studying him with an expression he couldn't read. "You're not what I expected," she said finally. "What did you expect? A man who wins a woman in a poker game?" She gave a bitter laugh. "I expected someone who'd see me as property. Someone who'd—" She stopped herself, color rising in her cheeks. Jacob understood what she wasn't saying and felt a surge of anger, not at her, but at the circumstances that had brought her to expect such treatment. "I told you yesterday I don't own people. Whatever that paper says, you're free to leave the moment this storm breaks." "And go where?" The question came out raw, unguarded. Charlie Morrison destroyed more than just his own life when he ran. Half the girls at the Silver Dollar are scattered to the wind, with no money and nowhere to go. The other half, she shook her head. Let's just say there are worse fates than being stuck on a mountain with a hermit. The casual way she dismissed the possibility of worse treatment sent another wave of anger through him. Jacob had lived apart from society for 15 years, but he'd grown up with a mother who'd raised him to respect women, and a father who'd taught him that a man's character was measured by how he treated those who had no power to defend themselves. "You'll be safe here," he said quietly. "That's a promise." Something in his voice must have convinced her, because her rigid posture relaxed slightly. She nodded once, then moved to the window again, watching the storm with the focused attention of someone trying to solve a problem. "How much food do we have?" she asked. "Enough venison to last several months if we're careful. Root vegetables from my garden. Dried beans, cornmeal, some flour. Coffee will run out first, but we can live without coffee." "Speak for yourself," Ruby Mae muttered, which surprised a short laugh out of him. "We'll have to ration the coffee," he amended. "And we'll need to conserve firewood. I've got a good supply, but in a storm like this, we'll burn through it faster than normal." Ruby Mae turned from the window, and he saw determination settling over her features like armor. "What do you need me to do?" The question caught him off guard. He'd expected complaints, tears, hysteria, the sort of reaction he'd seen from town women faced with far less daunting situations. Instead, she stood there ready to work, ready to do whatever was necessary to survive. "Can you actually cook?" he asked. "I mean, more than just what you might have done at the saloon." A shadow crossed her face. "I wasn't always a saloon girl, Mr. Stone. I can cook, preserve food, manage a household. I can even read and write if that surprises you." It did surprise him, though he tried not to show it. "Then you can help me inventory our supplies. We need to know exactly what we're working with." They spent the morning cataloguing everything in the cabin and the small root cellar Jacob had dug into the hillside behind the house. The assessment was sobering but not desperate. With careful rationing and some creative cooking, they could make the food last through even a hard winter. The real challenge would be living in such close quarters for months on end. By afternoon, the storm had intensified further. The wind rattled the cabin's walls and sent snow driving through every tiny gap in the chinking. Jacob found himself constantly checking the roof, listening for signs of stress in the timbers. He'd built the cabin to withstand harsh weather, but this storm was testing its limits. Ruby Mae proved surprisingly helpful. She took over the cooking without being asked, turning their simple ingredients into a hearty stew that was far better than anything Jacob had managed on his own. She cleaned and organized with efficient movements that spoke of long practice, and she worked without complaint despite the obvious discomfort of their situation. It was only as evening approached that the full reality of their predicament truly sank in. "Mr. Stone," Ruby Mae said, as they sat by the fire after dinner, "I need to ask you something directly." Jacob looked up from the piece of leather he was mending. "Go ahead. What are your expectations of me?" "I mean, what do you think?" She stopped, took a breath, and tried again. "That paper Charlie Morrison signed, it doesn't just make me your responsibility. In the eyes of the law, it makes me your property. Some men would see that as license to—" "Stop!" Jacob set down his work and looked at her directly. "I don't care what any paper says. You're a guest in my home, nothing more. You'll sleep in the loft, I'll sleep down here, and that's the end of it." Relief flickered across her face, but it was quickly replaced by something more complex. "You say that now, but it's going to be a long winter, Mr. Stone. We're going to be alone here for months, with no one around for 50 miles. You're a man, I'm a woman, and circumstances have a way of changing people's intentions." The bluntness of her words should have shocked him, but instead, he found himself respecting her for facing the situation head-on. She was right, of course. They were going to be isolated together for months, sharing a small space, dependent on each other for survival. It would be naive to pretend that wouldn't create complications. "I give you my word," he said finally. "You have nothing to fear from me." Ruby Mae studied his face for a long moment, then nodded. "I believe you mean that. But what happens if—" She gestured helplessly. "What happens if we start to care about each other? What happens if this becomes more than just two people waiting out a storm?" The question hung in the air between them, unspoken possibilities crackling like the fire that warmed them. Jacob found himself looking at her, really looking, for the first time since she'd arrived. The firelight caught the copper highlights in her hair and cast warm shadows across her face. She was beautiful. There was no denying that, but more than that. She was intelligent, capable, and brave enough to ask the hard questions that needed asking. "I suppose we'll deal with that if it happens," he said quietly. Outside, the wind howled louder and the snow continued to fall. The storm that had begun as an inconvenience was rapidly becoming something that would define both their lives. Jacob realized with a mixture of dread and something he didn't want to name that they had just crossed a threshold from which there might be no return. Ruby Mae seemed to sense it too. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and stared into the fire. 2 years, she said softly. "That's what they're saying this winter might last, isn't it? 2 years before the passes open again." Jacob had heard the same predictions from the old-timers in town, men who read the signs in animal behavior and plant growth, in the thickness of squirrel coats and the early migration of birds. A winter that could last 2 full years, with only brief respites of spring and summer before the snow returned. "Maybe," he said. "Maybe not." But as he watched the flames dance in the fireplace and listened to the storm rage outside, Jacob had the unsettling feeling that 2 years might be exactly what they were facing. 2 years alone together in this cabin, dependent on each other, with nothing but time and proximity to either destroy them or transform them into something neither of them could imagine. Ruby Mae rose from her chair and moved to the ladder leading to the loft. "Good night, Mr. Stone. Thank you for giving me your word. Good night, Miss Sinclair." As her footsteps faded overhead, Jacob remained by the fire, staring into the flames and wondering what he'd gotten himself into. Outside, the blizzard raged on, sealing their fate and binding them together in ways that a piece of paper never could. Whatever happened in the months ahead, there was no going back now. The first month of their enforced cohabitation passed like a careful dance between two people determined not to step on each other's toes. The blizzard had raged for 6 days before finally exhausting itself, leaving behind a world transformed by snow so deep it reached the cabin's windows. Jacob had tunneled his way to the corral to care for the horses, and another tunnel to the root cellar. But beyond those essential paths, the outside world had become inaccessible. Ruby Mae adapted to mountain life with a resilience that surprised him daily. She rose each morning before dawn, quietly stoking the fire and preparing coffee without waking him. By the time he stirred, she had usually started breakfast and was often sitting by the window with one of his books, reading by the early light that filtered through the snow-covered glass. Her presence changed everything about his carefully ordered routine, yet somehow she managed to fit into the rhythm of his days without completely disrupting them. She took over the cooking and cleaning with an efficiency that spoke of experience managing a household, transforming their simple ingredients into meals that were both nourishing and surprisingly flavorful. She mended his worn shirts with delicate stitches that would have done credit to a fine seamstress, and she organized his few possessions with a systematic approach that actually improved the cabin's functionality. Yet, for all her helpfulness, Jacob found himself increasingly on edge. It wasn't that Ruby Mae was difficult to live with, quite the opposite. It was the way she moved through his space with unconscious grace, the way her laugh sounded when she found something amusing in one of his books, the way she hummed softly while she worked. These small intimacies of shared living were both pleasant and deeply unsettling to a man who had grown accustomed to solitude. "You're wearing a path in the floor," Ruby Mae observed one morning as Jacob paced restlessly between the fireplace and the window. He stopped mid-stride, realizing she was right. The cabin suddenly felt impossibly small, the walls pressing in on him, despite the fact that it had served him perfectly well for 15 years. "Cabin fever," he said by way of explanation. "It hits everyone eventually when they're trapped inside too long." Ruby Mae looked up from her sewing, studying his face with those perceptive green eyes. "When's the last time you were confined like this, unable to go outside for your daily wanderings?" Jacob had to think about it. Even in the worst winters, he'd always managed to get out for short periods, checking his traps, hunting, simply walking the perimeter of his property. This complete confinement was new to him. "Never," he admitted. "I've always found a way to get out, even in bad weather." "Then it's harder on you than on me," Ruby Mae said matter-of-factly. "I spent most of my time indoors at the saloon. This isn't so different, except the company is better and the air is cleaner." There was something in the way she said it that made Jacob pause. He'd been so focused on his own discomfort that he hadn't considered how this situation might feel to her. For him, the cabin was a sanctuary he'd chosen. For her, it might feel like just another form of captivity. "Do you feel trapped here?" he asked. Ruby Mae set down her sewing and considered the question seriously. "Yes and no," she said finally. "The storm traps us both, but that's not the same as being trapped by circumstances or other people's choices. I have more freedom here in this cabin than I've had in years." "Freedom to do what?" She gestured toward the book in her lap, his copy of Shakespeare's sonnets, he realized with surprise. "To read without someone demanding my attention. To cook meals that aren't just designed to make men drink more. To have conversations that aren't—" She stopped herself, color rising in her cheeks. "That aren't what?" "That aren't negotiations," she finished quietly. Everything at the saloon was a negotiation. Every smile, every word, every gesture was calculated to achieve something. "Here, I can just be myself. whatever that turns out to be. The honesty in her voice caught him off guard. Jacob found himself really looking at her, not the careful, composed woman who'd arrived at his cabin, but the person underneath who was taking advantage of this strange sanctuary to rediscover herself. "Who are you when you're not negotiating?" he asked. Ruby Mae smiled, and it was the first completely unguarded expression he'd seen from her. "I'm still figuring that out. It's been a long time since anyone asked me that question." The conversation was interrupted by a sound that made them both freeze, a long, mournful howl echoing across the valley. Then another and another, until a full pack of wolves was singing their wild song in the pre-dawn darkness. Jacob moved quickly to the rifle rack beside the door, checking the load with practiced motions. "They're closer than usual," he said. "The deep snow is making hunting harder for them." Ruby Mae joined him at the window, peering out into the grey light. "Are we safe in here?" "The cabin's solid, and wolves rarely attack humans unless they're desperate. But we'll need to be careful when we go out to tend the horses." As if summoned by his words, thunder whinnied nervously from the corral, followed by an answering call from Ruby Mae's mare, Belle. The horses could smell the predators, and their fear carried clearly on the still air. "I should check on them," Jacob said, reaching for his heavy coat. "I'll come with you." "No." The word came out sharper than he'd intended. "Wolves are unpredictable, especially when they're hungry. I won't risk you getting hurt." Ruby Mae's eyes flashed with something that looked like anger. "I'm not some delicate flower, Mr. Stone. I can handle myself." "This isn't about what you can handle. It's about what makes sense. You don't know the terrain, you don't know the animals, and you don't have experience with predators. And I never will if you don't let me learn." The argument that followed was their first real conflict, and it revealed tensions that had been building beneath their careful politeness. Ruby Mae accused him of treating her like a helpless child. Jacob countered that he was simply being practical about their safety. Their voices rose until they were nearly shouting, and the horses outside grew increasingly agitated. Finally, Jacob grabbed his rifle and headed for the door without another word. He spent 20 minutes in the bitter cold, checking on the animals and reinforcing the corral fence while scanning the tree line for signs of the wolf pack. When he returned, Ruby Mae was sitting by the fire with her arms crossed, radiating displeasure. "The horses are fine," he said as he hung up his coat, "but we'll need to be extra vigilant. Wolves are smart and they're patient." "Good to know," Ruby Mae replied coolly. "I'm sure you'll handle everything perfectly without any input from me." Jacob sighed and sat down across from her. "Look, I'm not trying to control you, but I've been dealing with wilderness dangers for 15 years. You've been here a month. There's a difference. I understand that. But how am I supposed to learn if you don't teach me? What happens if something happens to you? What happens if I need to survive on my own?" The question hit home because it was entirely reasonable. If an accident befell him, Ruby Mae would be completely helpless, stranded in the wilderness with no knowledge of how to protect herself or survive. "You're right," he admitted reluctantly. "I'll teach you what you need to know. But when there's immediate danger, like wolves around the property, I need you to trust my judgment." Ruby Mae nodded, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "Fair enough. But I want to learn everything, Mr. Stone. How to shoot, how to track, how to read weather signs. All of it." Over the following weeks, Jacob found himself becoming Ruby Mae's reluctant instructor in wilderness survival. She proved to be an eager and capable student, mastering the basics of rifle shooting with surprising speed and showing a natural aptitude for reading animal tracks in the snow. She learned to identify the sounds that meant danger versus those that were simply part of the mountain's daily symphony. More importantly, she began to contribute in ways that went beyond cooking and cleaning. Her keen observation skills, honed by years of reading people's intentions in dangerous situations, translated well to reading the subtle signs of the natural world. She was the first to notice when the wolves had moved on to other hunting grounds, and she correctly predicted a break in the weather that allowed them to venture outside for the first time in over a week. But with her growing competence came a new set of challenges, and Ruby Mae became more confident and capable. She also became more assertive about her opinions and desires. The carefully polite distance they'd maintained began to break down, replaced by a more natural but also more volatile dynamic. They disagreed about everything from how to prepare their meals to whether certain risks were worth taking. These arguments never escalated to the level of their first fight, but they created an undercurrent of tension that made the small cabin feel even smaller. Jacob found himself constantly aware of her presence, her moods, her reactions to everything he said and did. Worse, he was beginning to notice things about her that had nothing to do with survival or practical concerns. The way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear when she was concentrating, the soft sound she made when she was dreaming, the graceful line of her neck when she leaned over her sewing. These observations were dangerous territory for a man who had sworn off emotional entanglements, and Jacob tried desperately to push them from his mind. But in the intimate confines of the cabin, with only each other for company and the long winter nights stretching ahead, some things were proving impossible to ignore. The sewing kit had been Ruby Mae's one personal possession that revealed the woman she'd been before life had forced her into different circumstances. Jacob discovered it by accident one evening when he knocked over her traveling bag while reaching for more firewood. The contents spilled across the floor, a few pieces of worn clothing, some coins, and a small leather case that opened to reveal the finest collection of needles and threads he'd ever seen. "Sorry," he said, kneeling to help gather her things. "I didn't mean to." "It's all right," Ruby Mae said quickly, but he noticed how carefully she handled the sewing kit, how her fingers lingered on the silk threads that caught the firelight like jewels. "These are beautiful," Jacob observed, holding up a spool of deep blue thread that felt like water between his fingers. "They belonged to my mother," Ruby Mae said softly. "She was a seamstress before she married my father. Told me everything she knew about working with fabric and thread. It was the first time she'd mentioned her family, and Jacob sensed there was more to the story. What happened to her? Cholera when I was 16. My father died 2 years later in a mining accident." Ruby Mae took the thread from his hands, rolling it carefully back into the kit. "After that, I had to find my own way in the world. A young woman alone doesn't have many options, especially if she's particular about keeping her virtue intact." The bitter irony in her voice told the rest of the story without words. Jacob understood now how a woman with such refined skills and obvious education had ended up working in a saloon. The world was harsh to women without protection, offering few paths between starvation and compromise. "You could have found work as a seamstress," he said. "I tried. But established seamstresses don't take kindly to competition, and most decent families won't hire a woman without references. The saloon offered steady money and a roof over my head. It seemed like the practical choice at the time." Over the following days, Jacob watched Ruby Mae transform their crude mountain cabin with the same skills her mother had taught her. She fashioned curtains from an old sheet, creating privacy and softness in what had been a purely functional space. She mended his clothes with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible, and she even managed to alter one of her own dresses to be more practical for their mountain life. But it was her work on their shared meals that truly revealed her capabilities. Using her sewing kit's small scissors and some creativity, she began improving their dining experience in ways that had nothing to do with cooking. She cut strips of cloth to serve as napkins, arranged their simple food with an eye for presentation that made even venison stew look appealing, and created small touches of beauty that transformed their necessary sustenance into something that felt like proper meals. "Where did you learn to do all this?" Jacob asked one evening, as she arranged wildflowers she'd somehow coaxed to bloom in jars near the windows. "My mother believed that a woman should know how to create beauty wherever she found herself," Ruby Mae replied. "She said that grace and refinement weren't about having fine things. They were about bringing dignity to whatever circumstances you faced." Jacob found himself watching her with growing appreciation as she moved around the cabin, transforming their shared space with small touches that made it feel less like a survival shelter and more like a home. She hung his tools on the walls in arrangements that were both functional and pleasing to the eye. She organized their books into neat stacks that invited reading. She even managed to make their sleeping arrangements feel less awkward by creating a sense of separate, private spaces within the single room. But with this growing appreciation came a dangerous awareness of Ruby Mae as a woman rather than simply a housemate. The way she moved had an unconscious grace that drew his eye, despite his best efforts to look elsewhere. Her laugh, when something genuinely amused her, had a quality that made him want to hear it again. The concentration on her face as she worked on some delicate task revealed an intelligence and dedication that he found increasingly attractive. These observations troubled Jacob deeply. He'd spent 15 years learning to live without emotional complications, and he wasn't prepared for the way Ruby Mae's presence was awakening feelings he'd thought he'd successfully buried. Worse, he was beginning to suspect that his feelings might not be entirely one-sided. He caught her watching him sometimes when she thought he wasn't looking. When he chopped wood or performed other physical tasks, he noticed her gaze lingering on his hands, his shoulders, the rhythm of his movements. She'd begun asking questions about his past, gentle inquiries that probed at the edges of the pain that had driven him to the mountains. And there were moments, brief, charged instants when their hands brushed while passing objects, or when they found themselves standing closer than necessary, when the air between them seemed to crackle with unspoken possibilities. The tension came to a head on a particularly bitter night in late November. A new storm had blown in, though nothing like the massive blizzard that had first trapped them together. This was simply a hard, cold wind that drove snow against the windows and made the cabin's timbers creak ominously. Ruby Mae had been unusually quiet all day, and Jacob noticed her glancing frequently at the windows with an expression he couldn't quite read. After dinner, as they sat by the fire with their evening reading, she suddenly set down her book and looked at him directly. "May I ask you something personal, Mr. Stone?" Jacob tensed, sensing that whatever she wanted to know would take them into territory he'd been trying to avoid. "You can ask. I can't promise I'll answer. What happened to make you choose this life?" A man doesn't cut himself off from the world without a powerful reason. The question he'd been dreading since her arrival. Jacob stared into the fire, watching the flames dance and trying to decide how much of the truth he was willing to share. "I lost someone," he said finally. "Someone I loved very much. It seemed easier to live alone than to risk that kind of pain again." "What was her name?" "Sarah." The name felt strange on his lips after so many years of silence. "We were engaged to be married. She died of influenza the week before our wedding." Ruby Mae was quiet for a long moment, and when Jacob looked at her, he saw understanding and sympathy in her eyes rather than the pity he'd expected. "How long ago?" she asked gently. 15 years this spring, and you've been alone ever since." Jacob nodded, unable to trust his voice. "That's a long time to carry that kind of grief," Ruby Mae said softly. "Your Sarah must have been a remarkable woman to inspire such devotion." She was. Jacob found himself remembering Sarah's laugh, her gentle nature, the way she'd looked at him with such trust and love. "She believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. Made me want to be a better man. I'm sure she wouldn't have wanted you to spend your life alone because of her." The observation hit closer to home than Jacob was comfortable with. Maybe not. But some things you can't risk twice. Can't or won't. The challenge in her voice made him look at her more carefully. Ruby Mae was watching him with an expression that was both compassionate and frustrated, as if she understood his pain, but also thought he was being foolish about it. "Does it matter?" he asked. "It might. Kent suggests you don't have a choice. Won't suggest you're making one, and choices can be changed." They stared at each other across the small space between their chairs, and Jacob felt the weight of all the things they weren't saying hanging in the air between them. He was acutely aware of how beautiful she looked in the firelight, how her presence had begun to feel not just natural, but necessary to his daily happiness. "Ruby Mae," he said carefully, "we should probably talk about what's happening here. What do you think is happening?" "You know what I mean." She was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Yes, I know what you mean. The question is, what do we do about it?" Jacob stood abruptly and moved to the window, staring out at the swirling snow. "Nothing. We're trapped here together by circumstances, and it's natural that we might develop certain feelings. But acting on them would be a mistake." "Why?" The simple question forced him to examine his own reasoning. "Because when spring comes, you'll want to leave. You'll want to return to civilization, to a life that offers more than this isolated cabin. And He stopped, realizing he was about to reveal more than he intended. "And you?" Ruby Mae prompted. "And I can't go through losing someone again." Ruby Mae rose from her chair and moved to stand beside him at the window. "You're making a lot of assumptions about what I want, Mr. Stone, and you're letting fear make your decisions for you. Fear keeps people alive. It also keeps them from living." They stood together in silence, watching the storm and dealing with their own internal tempests. Finally, Ruby Mae spoke again, her voice so soft he almost didn't hear her over the wind. "I've spent years having my choices made for me by other people's wants and needs. I won't let that happen again, even if the person making the choice thinks he's protecting me." She returned to her chair and picked up her book, effectively ending the conversation. But Jacob remained at the window long after she'd retired to the loft, staring out at the snow and wondering if he was being wise or simply cowardly. The truth was, he was falling in love with Ruby Mae Sinclair, and that terrified him more than any blizzard or pack of wolves ever could. Behind him, the fire crackled softly, and overhead he could hear the gentle sounds of Ruby Mae preparing for sleep. The cabin that had been his sanctuary for so many years was becoming something else entirely, a place where two wounded people were slowly healing each other, whether they were brave enough to admit it or not. The shared meal table became the heart of their evolving relationship as winter deepened into its most brutal phase. What had begun as simple necessity, two people sharing food for survival, gradually transformed into something richer and more complex. Their evening meals stretched longer, conversations meandering from practical matters to deeper territories neither had expected to explore. Jacob had built the table during his third winter alone, crafting it from pine planks during the long, dark months when outdoor work was impossible. It was sturdy and functional, large enough for two people, but small enough to fit comfortably in the cabin's limited space. Now, with Ruby Mae across from him each evening, the table seemed to create its own intimate world within their larger sanctuary. "Tell me about the books," Ruby Mae said one evening as they lingered over cups of carefully rationed coffee. She gestured toward the shelves that held his small collection. "Most of them are practical, hunting, trapping, survival. But then there's Shakespeare." Jacob felt heat rise in his cheeks. The sonnets had been Sarah's favorite, and he'd brought them with him as much for memory as for solace. But admitting that would open territories he wasn't ready to explore. "A man needs more than practical knowledge to keep his mind sharp," he said evasively. "Which are your favorites?" "I don't really have favorites." Ruby Mae studied his face with the perceptive gaze that had become so familiar and unsettling. "You're lying. I've seen you reading it when you think I'm not watching. And I've heard you recite lines under your breath when you're working." Caught, Jacob could only shrug. The 18th sonnet. "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Sarah used to—" He stopped himself, but too late. "Used to what?" "She used to say it was about finding something beautiful enough to last forever." Ruby Mae was quiet for a moment, turning her coffee cup in her hands. "She sounds like she was a woman of substance." She was. She read everything she could get her hands on, believed that knowledge was the one thing no one could take away from you. Smart woman. What else did she believe? Jacob found himself talking about Sarah in ways he hadn't in 15 years. Not the idealized memory he'd carried, but the real woman. Her laughter, her stubbornness, her way of seeing hope in situations that seemed hopeless. Ruby Mae listened without interruption, asking occasional questions that showed she was truly hearing him rather than simply being polite. "She would have liked you," Jacob said finally, surprising himself with the admission. "What makes you say that? You have the same strength. The same refusal to let circumstances defeat you." Ruby Mae smiled, but there was sadness in it. "Circumstances have defeated me plenty of times, Mr. Stone. I've just learned to get back up. That's not defeat. That's resilience." Their conversations became the anchor of each day, something both looked forward to as the hours of work and careful coexistence passed. They talked about books, about the subtle changes in weather that Jacob taught her to read, about the animals they glimpsed through the windows. But gradually, their discussions deepened beyond the practical or academic. Ruby Mae proved to be a keen observer of human nature, sharing insights gleaned from her years of watching people at their most unguarded moments. She could read the subtle signs of deception, understand the motivations that drove people to make poor choices, and see through pretense to the genuine person underneath. "People think saloon girls are just decoration," she said one evening as snow pelted the windows. "But we see everything. We watch men when they think no one important is looking, when they've had enough drink to drop their masks. You learn to read people quickly when your safety depends on it. What do you see when you look at me?" Jacob asked, then immediately regretted the question. He wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Ruby Mae considered him thoughtfully, her green eyes studying his face in the flickering firelight. "I see a man who's forgotten how to forgive himself. Someone who chose exile because he thinks he deserves it, not because he actually wants it." The accuracy of her observation hit him like a physical blow. "You don't know what you're talking about, don't I? You've built yourself a prison here, Jacob, and you've been serving a sentence for a crime you didn't commit. Sarah's death wasn't your fault, but you've been punishing yourself for it anyway." It was the first time she'd used his given name, and hearing it from her lips sent an unexpected warmth through him. But her words stung because they contained too much truth. "Some things can't be forgiven," he said quietly, "such as, I should have taken better care of her. Should have gotten the doctor sooner, should have been God himself, capable of stopping disease and death." Ruby Mae's voice was gentle but firm. "Jacob, influenza killed thousands of people that year. Strong people, weak people, rich and poor alike. What makes you think you could have changed what medical science couldn't prevent?" "Because I loved her. Love doesn't make us omnipotent. It just makes us feel like we should be." The conversation ended there, but Jacob found himself returning to her words over the following days. Was she right? Had he been punishing himself for something beyond his control? The possibility was both liberating and terrifying. As December deepened, their daily routines became more synchronized and natural. Ruby Mae rose before dawn to start the coffee and stoke the fire. Jacob tended to the horses and checked their supplies. They worked together to maintain their small world, cooking, cleaning, mending, and preparing for the long months still ahead. But it was the small, unguarded moments that revealed how much their relationship was changing. The way Ruby Mae would absent-mindedly hum while she cooked, filling the cabin with music that Jacob realized he'd been hungry for without knowing it. The way Jacob would find excuses to stand near her when she was working, drawn by her presence in ways that had nothing to do with practical necessity. One evening, as Ruby Mae sat by the fire mending one of his shirts, Jacob found himself studying the concentration on her face, the careful precision of her stitches, the way the firelight caught the copper highlights in her hair. "You're staring," she said without looking up from her work. "Sorry, I didn't say I minded." The simple statement hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither was quite ready to address directly. Jacob felt his pulse quicken and forced himself to look away. "Ruby Mae," he began, then stopped, not sure what he wanted to say. "Yes? Thank you. For being here. For making this," he gestured around the cabin, "for making this feel like more than just survival." She looked up then, her needle suspended in mid-stitch. "You don't need to thank me for that. This place, this time with you, it's given me something I'd forgotten I wanted. What's that? Peace. The chance to be myself without performance or pretense. She returned to her sewing, but her voice grew softer. I haven't felt this safe in years, Jacob. Not just physically safe, but what? Safe to care about someone again. The admission hit him with unexpected force. Jacob realized that somewhere in the weeks of shared meals and conversations, of watching her transform his stark cabin into something warmer and more welcoming, he'd begun to hope for things he'd thought were lost to him forever, but with that hope came renewed fear. The closer they grew, the more he had to lose when circumstances inevitably changed. And change they would. Spring would come eventually. The snow would melt. And Ruby Mae would have choices beyond staying trapped in a mountain cabin with a man who'd forgotten how to live in the world. That night, as he lay in his bed, listening to the soft sounds of Ruby Mae settling into sleep above him, Jacob found himself caught between longing and terror. For the first time in 15 years, he wanted something more than solitude. But wanting and having were different things, and the gap between them felt as vast and treacherous as the winter landscape surrounding their small sanctuary. Outside, the wind continued its endless song, and inside, two people who had found unexpected solace in each other's company continued their careful dance around feelings that grew stronger with each passing day. Jacob's hidden journal had been his silent companion for years, a leather-bound repository of thoughts too private to speak aloud. He'd started it during his second winter alone, when the isolation had threatened to drive him mad with its completeness. Writing had become his way of maintaining sanity, of processing the endless internal dialogue that filled the quiet hours. The journal lived in a wooden box beneath his bed, alongside a few other personal items he'd brought from his former life. Sarah's engagement ring wrapped in soft cloth, a photograph of his parents, faded but still recognizable, a letter from his brother in Denver, years old and never answered. These were the artifacts of the man he'd been before grief and guilt had driven him into exile. Since Ruby Mae's arrival, the journal had taken on new significance. His entries, once sparse and focused on practical matters, weather observations, hunting success, supply inventories, had become longer and more introspective. He found himself documenting not just the external details of their shared life, but the internal changes he was experiencing. December 15th. Ruby Mae asked about the books today. Ended up talking about Sarah for the first time in years. Strange how natural it felt to share those memories with her. RM listened without judgment, seemed to understand the difference between honoring the past and being trapped by it. December 20th. Caught myself watching her while she worked on mending. The way she concentrates, the careful precision of her hands. She's transforming this place, making it feel like a home instead of just shelter. Not sure when that happened or when I started wanting it to happen. December 23rd. She said she feels safe here. The way she said it made me realize how dangerous her former life must have been. Can't stand the thought of her returning to that world when spring comes. But what right do I have to want her to stay? What could I offer her besides isolation and loneliness? The entries continued, chronicling his growing attachment and his mounting anxiety about the future. Writing forced him to confront feelings he'd been trying to ignore, to acknowledge the depth of his emotional investment in Ruby Mae's presence. Spring seemed impossibly far away when the snows lay 10 feet deep and the temperature hadn't risen above freezing in weeks. But Jacob had lived in the mountains long enough to know that weather could change suddenly, that warm Chinook winds could appear without warning and transform the landscape in days. The possibility that their time together might end sooner than expected haunted his quiet moments. Ruby Mae, meanwhile, seemed to be undergoing her own transformation. The careful reserve she'd maintained during her first weeks in the cabin gradually gave way to something more natural and unguarded. She laughed more often, spoke more freely about her thoughts and feelings, and began to assert her own preferences about how they organized their shared life. We need better lighting for evening reading, she announced one day, studying the way shadows fell across their small table. "I've been thinking about how to position mirrors to reflect the firelight more efficiently." "Mirrors?" Jacob looked around the cabin. "I don't have any mirrors." "I know. But you have some polished metal surfaces. Your shaving mirror, the bottom of that tin pot. If we angle them correctly, we could create pools of reflected light that would make it easier to read after dark." She was right, and over the next few days, Ruby Mae engineered a system of carefully positioned reflective surfaces that nearly doubled the effective light available during the long evenings. It was ingenious and practical, the sort of creative problem-solving that impressed Jacob more than any feminine accomplishment he'd ever witnessed. "Where did you learn to think like that?" he asked as they tested her lighting arrangement. "Necessity. When you're trying to read by candlelight that costs money you don't have, you learn to make the most of every flame." "You read a lot?" Before I became a saloon girl?" Ruby Mae's tone was matter-of-fact rather than defensive. "Every chance I got. Books were my escape, my way of traveling to places and times that were better than wherever I happened to be." These glimpses into her past revealed a woman of considerable intelligence and determination, someone who had used education as a lifeline during dark periods. Jacob found himself increasingly amazed that circumstances had conspired to bring such a person into his isolated world. But with growing appreciation came growing confusion about his own feelings. The careful emotional distance he'd maintained for 15 years was crumbling, replaced by an attachment that felt both wonderful and terrifying. He caught himself planning activities that would keep Ruby Mae engaged and happy. He found excuses to stand near her while she worked. He looked forward to their evening conversations with an anticipation that reminded him uncomfortably of his younger self, the man he'd been before loss had taught him the dangers of caring too much. The crisis came on a particularly bitter night in late December. A storm had blown in during the afternoon, bringing temperatures that dropped below anything they'd experienced so far. The wind howled like a living thing, and despite the cabin's solid construction, Jacob could feel cold seeping through every tiny gap in the walls. "We need to conserve heat," he said, studying the fire that seemed inadequate against the supernatural cold. "Close off the loft. Bring your bedding down here by the fireplace." Ruby Mae nodded without argument, gathering her blankets and pillow from the loft. They arranged their sleeping areas on opposite sides of the fireplace, close enough to benefit from the heat, but far enough apart to maintain some semblance of propriety. But as the night deepened and the cold intensified, it became clear that even their proximity to the fire wasn't enough. Jacob woke several times to the sound of Ruby Mae's teeth chattering, despite the heavy blankets wrapped around her. "This isn't working," he said finally, around midnight. "We need to share body heat or risk hypothermia." Ruby Mae sat up, her face barely visible in the dying firelight. "What are you suggesting?" "Survival," Jacob said, though his heart was racing at the implications. "If we pool our blankets and sleep close together, our combined body heat will keep us both warm." It was entirely practical, the sort of decision that could mean the difference between life and death in extreme conditions. But it was also the destruction of the careful physical distance that had allowed them to maintain emotional equilibrium. Ruby Mae was quiet for a long moment, then nodded. "You're right. It's about survival." They combined their bedding into a single warm nest near the fire, then lay down together with careful inches between their bodies. But even that small distance couldn't disguise the intimacy of the situation, the sound of each other's breathing, the warmth radiating between them, the awareness of another person's presence in the most vulnerable moments of sleep. Jacob lay awake for hours, acutely conscious of Ruby Mae beside him. When she shifted in her sleep and her hand brushed against his arm, the contact sent electricity through him that had nothing to do with warmth and everything to do with the feelings he'd been fighting for weeks. By morning, the storm had passed and temperatures had risen enough to return to their separate sleeping arrangements. But something fundamental had changed. The physical barrier that had helped them maintain emotional distance was gone. replaced by the memory of shared warmth and the recognition that their careful boundaries were more fragile than either had wanted to admit. "Last night," Ruby Mae said as they shared their morning coffee, "not meeting his eyes was about survival," Jacob finished. Nothing more. But even as he said the words, Jacob knew they weren't true. The line between survival and something deeper had been crossed, and there was no going back to the careful distance they'd maintained before. They were moving into territory that was both thrilling and dangerous, and Jacob found himself wondering if either of them had the strength to resist what was growing between them. Outside, the mountain wind continued its eternal song, but inside the cabin, two people who had found refuge in each other's company were discovering that some storms couldn't be weathered without changing everything in their wake. The wanted poster arrived with the first mail delivery of the new year, brought by a half-frozen postal worker who'd fought his way up the mountain trail during a brief break in the weather. Jacob rarely received mail, and when he did, it was usually orders for furs or notices from the territorial government. This time, the postal worker handed him a thin envelope along with an official-looking document that made Jacob's blood run cold. "Bounty notice," the postal worker explained, stamping his feet to restore circulation. "You've been instructed to post these at every settlement and deliver them to all known residents in the territory. Someone's offering serious money for information." After the man left, Jacob unfolded the poster with hands that trembled slightly. What he saw made his heart stop. Wanted Ruby Sinclair, a.k.a. Ruby Red, $500 reward for information, leading to capture. Wanted for theft and murder in the city of Denver, considered armed and dangerous below. The text was a rough but recognizable sketch of Ruby Mae's face, accurate enough that anyone who had seen her would make the connection immediately. Jacob stared at the poster for a long moment, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The woman who had shared his cabin for months, who had brought warmth and companionship to his isolated existence, was wanted for murder. The sum offered was enormous, more money than most people in the territory saw in a decade. He heard footsteps behind him and quickly folded the poster, shoving it into his coat pocket just as Ruby Mae emerged from the cabin. "Who was that?" she asked, noting the tracks in the snow. "Postal worker. Just delivering some territorial notices." Ruby Mae studied his face with the perceptive gaze that had become so familiar. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Bad news?" "Nothing important." The lie felt like acid on his tongue, but Jacob wasn't ready to confront what he'd just learned. "Just government paperwork." But over the following days, Jacob found himself studying Ruby Mae with new eyes, looking for signs of the dangerous woman described in the wanted poster. Could the gentle hands that had mended his clothes have committed murder? Could the woman who read Shakespeare by firelight and created beauty from scraps of fabric really be a killer? The doubt ate at him like a cancer. He found himself watching her movements, analyzing her words for hidden meanings, wondering if everything about their relationship had been a lie. The easy intimacy they'd developed began to feel dangerous, and Jacob started keeping his rifle closer at hand. Ruby Mae noticed the change immediately. "What's wrong?" she asked one evening as they sat by the fire. "You've been different since the postal worker came. Distant, suspicious." "I'm fine." "No, you're not. You're watching me like you expect me to attack you." "Did something in that mail concern me?" Jacob's hand moved instinctively to his coat pocket, where the wanted poster lay folded and worn from repeated reading. "What makes you think it would concern you?" "Because I've seen that look before. In Denver, when the law was closing in. When people were trying to decide if turning me in was worth the risk." The casual admission hit Jacob like a physical blow. She knew there was a warrant out for her arrest. She'd been expecting this moment. "So it's true," he said quietly. Ruby Mae went very still, her green eyes fixed on his face. "What's true?" Jacob pulled the poster from his pocket and laid it on the table between them. Ruby Mae glanced at it, then back at his face, her expression revealing nothing. $500, she said calmly. "They've raised the bounty." "So you knew." "Of course I knew." "Why do you think I was working in a saloon in a nowhere town like Bent Creek?" I was running, Jacob. I've been running for over a year. The confirmation should have clarified everything, but instead, it only raised more questions. Did you do it? Did you kill someone? Ruby Mae was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When she spoke, her voice was steady but tired. His name was Marcus Whitman. He was a wealthy businessman in Denver, well-connected, well-respected. He was also a man who believed his money gave him the right to take whatever he wanted from women who had no power to stop him. Jacob waited, sensing there was more to the story. I was working as a seamstress then, trying to make an honest living. Marcus hired me to make some clothes for his wife, paid well, treated me with respect at first. But after a few weeks, he started making demands that had nothing to do with sewing. When I refused, he threatened to ruin my reputation, ensure I could never find work in Denver again. And then he tried to take by force what I wouldn't give willingly. Ruby Mae's voice hardened. I fought back. Hit him with a brass candlestick when he tore my dress and threw me down on his desk. Hit him harder than I intended. Jacob studied her face, looking for signs of deception. That sounds like self-defense, not murder. Try explaining that to a judge when the dead man is a pillar of the community and you're nobody special. Marcus Whitman's friends made sure I was painted as a scheming woman who killed him for his money. They claimed I seduced him, then robbed and murdered him when he rejected my advances. The bitterness in her voice rang with truth. Jacob had seen enough of the world to know how justice worked differently for the rich and poor, for men and women. A wealthy man's word would always carry more weight than a working woman's, especially when he was dead and couldn't contradict whatever story best served his reputation. So you ran. What choice did I have? Stay and hang for defending myself? I took what money I could find in his office, figured he owed me that much for what he tried to do, and left Denver that same night. And you've been running ever since. Ruby Mae nodded. Changing my name? Changing my appearance when I could, staying in places where people don't ask too many questions. The saloon in Bent Creek was supposed to be temporary, just until I could figure out my next move. Jacob felt the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders. Everything had changed with the arrival of that poster. Ruby Mae wasn't just a woman seeking shelter from a storm. She was a fugitive with a price on her head. Harboring her made him an accessory to murder in the eyes of the law. The postal worker will remember delivering this to my cabin, he said slowly. If anyone comes looking, they'll know you're here. I know. Ruby Mae stood and began gathering her few possessions. I should leave before I bring trouble down on you. You've been kind to me, Jacob, and I won't repay that by making you an outlaw. Where will you go? I don't know. Further west, maybe. California. Somewhere far enough away that Marcus Whitman's name doesn't carry weight. Jacob watched her methodical preparations and felt something tear inside his chest. The thought of Ruby Mae leaving, of returning to a life of running and hiding, was unbearable. But keeping her here meant risking everything he'd built, everything he'd worked for. Ruby Mae, he said as she folded her few dresses. Stop! She looked up at him, hope and resignation warring in her green eyes. Tell me the truth. All of it. Did you kill Marcus Whitman? Yes, she said without hesitation. I killed him. But it was self-defense, Jacob. I swear to you on my mother's grave, I was protecting myself from a man who would have raped me and destroyed my life anyway. Jacob studied her face, searching for any sign of deception. What he saw was fear, determination, and a bone-deep weariness that spoke of too many months of running and hiding. This wasn't the face of a cold-blooded killer. This was a woman who had been forced to make an impossible choice and was still paying the price. Unpack your things, he said finally. Jacob, unpack them. You're not leaving. You don't understand. If they find me here, then we'll deal with it when it happens. Jacob moved to the window, staring out at the snow-covered landscape that had become their sanctuary. Nobody's traveling these mountains in winter conditions like this. Spring is still months away. We have time to figure this out. Ruby Mae stared at him as if he'd lost his mind. You're willing to risk everything for me. Why? The question hung in the air between them, demanding an honesty Jacob wasn't sure he was ready to give. But the poster had forced a crisis that couldn't be avoided with careful distance and unspoken feelings. "Because I love you," he said simply. "Because the thought of you out there alone, afraid, running for the rest of your life, is worse than any risk to myself." The words seemed to echo in the small cabin, changing everything between them forever. Ruby Mae's eyes filled with tears, and she sank back down onto her chair as if her legs could no longer support her. "Jacob," she whispered, "you don't know what you're saying. I know exactly what I'm saying. I love you, Ruby Mae Sinclair, and I'm not letting you face this alone." Outside, the wind began to pick up, promising another storm. But inside the cabin, two people who had found each other against all odds were facing the reality that love sometimes meant choosing to stand together against a world determined to tear them apart. Jacob's rifle had been his constant companion for 15 years, a Winchester 44-40 that had never failed him in situations where failure meant death. He'd used it to hunt game, drive off predators, and maintain the delicate balance that allowed a man to survive alone in the wilderness. Now, as he cleaned and checked its mechanism for the third time that morning, the weapon represented something entirely different: his willingness to fight for love rather than mere survival. The wanted poster lay spread on the table between them, its stark text a constant reminder of the forces arrayed against Ruby Mae. Since Jacob's declaration of love 3 weeks earlier, their relationship had transformed completely. The careful boundaries they'd maintained had crumbled, replaced by an intimacy born of shared danger and mutual devotion. "Tell me about Marcus Whitman's connections," Jacob said as he loaded cartridges into the rifle's magazine. "Who has the money and influence to keep hunting you after all this time?" Ruby Mae looked up from her own preparations, cleaning Jacob's spare pistol with the competence he'd taught her over the long winter months. "His brother Thomas. He's the territorial judge in Denver, and Marcus's death cost him more than just family grief. The Whitman brothers had business dealings that couldn't survive scrutiny. With Marcus dead and people asking questions about his finances, Thomas needed a scapegoat to redirect attention. So this isn't really about justice. It's about protecting a corrupt judge's reputation." "Justice?" Ruby Mae's laugh held no humor. "Thomas Whitman wouldn't recognize justice if it bit him. This is about power, money, and keeping ugly truths buried with his brother." Jacob set down his rifle and moved to the window, studying the landscape that had been their sanctuary for so many months. The snows were beginning to show signs of the coming spring thaw. Patches of dark earth appeared on the southern slopes, and the creek that ran through the valley was starting to sing with increased flow. Soon the mountain passes would be navigable again. "How long do we have?" Ruby Mae asked, following his gaze. "Another month, maybe 6 weeks before anyone could make it up here easily. But if they're serious about that bounty, they'll try as soon as the trails are passable." "You keep saying they. I'm the one with the price on my head." "Jacob, this doesn't have to be your fight." Jacob turned from the window, taking in her determined expression, the way she held the pistol with growing confidence, the strength that had carried her through months of running and hiding. The woman who'd arrived at his cabin as reluctant cargo in a poker game had become someone he couldn't imagine living without. "Yes, it does," he said quietly. "The moment I chose to love you, it became my fight too." Over the following days, they developed plans with the methodical care of people who understood that their lives depended on thinking through every possibility. Jacob's military experience, long dormant, resurfaced as he assessed their defensive position and planned for multiple scenarios. The cabin sat in a natural fortress, a narrow valley accessible by only 2 approaches, with rocky outcroppings that provided cover and elevated positions for marksmen. Jacob had chosen the location originally for its isolation and natural defenses against wildlife. Now those same features would serve against human predators. "If they come, they'll likely approach from the main trail," Jacob explained, sketching the terrain on a piece of paper. "It's the easiest route, and most bounty hunters aren't wilderness experts. But we can't assume they'll be that predictable. What about the back way, through the creek bed?" possible but difficult. They'd have to leave their horses a mile away and approach on foot through rough terrain. Still, we'll need to watch for it. Ruby Mae studied the crude map, her tactical instincts sharper than Jacob had expected. How many do you think will come? Depends on how badly Judge Whitman wants you dead. Could be one professional bounty hunter, could be a small army. $500 is serious money, but it's not enough to tempt an entire posse into dangerous mountain country. They prepared with grim efficiency. Jacob inventoried their ammunition, enough for a sustained fight if necessary, but not enough for a siege. He showed Ruby Mae the locations of cached supplies he'd hidden around the property over the years. Emergency stores that could keep them alive if the cabin became untenable. Most importantly, he began teaching her to shoot with deadly accuracy. Ruby Mae had proven adept with the rifle for hunting, but combat shooting required different skills. They practiced every day, using improvised targets set up around the valley, working on quick acquisition of targets and shooting under stress. Remember? Jacob coached as Ruby Mae sighted down the rifle barrel. In a real fight, your targets will be shooting back. Don't take time for perfect aim if adequate aim will do the job. She squeezed the trigger, and the distant target, a piece of bark nailed to a tree, splintered satisfyingly. How do you know so much about fighting? Jacob had been dreading that question. I wasn't always a hermit. Before Sarah, before I came to the mountains, I served in the cavalry, fought in the Indian Wars, did some scouting for the army. You never mentioned that. It's not something I'm proud of. Young men do foolish things before they understand the cost of violence. Ruby Mae lowered the rifle and studied his face. Is that why you're so good at reading the country? At moving without being seen? Part of it. The rest came from living out here alone for 15 years. As the days passed, Jacob found himself remembering skills he'd thought forgotten. How to set an ambush, how to use terrain to maximum advantage, how to move silently through wilderness country. But more than tactical knowledge, his military experience had taught him something invaluable: how to remain calm under extreme pressure, how to think clearly when death was a trigger pull away. You're different, Ruby Mae observed one evening as they cleaned their weapons by firelight. More focused, more dangerous. I'm preparing to protect what matters to me. Have you ever killed a man, Jacob? The question hung in the air between them like smoke. Jacob was quiet for a long moment, remembering faces from long ago, choices made in the heat of battle when survival demanded terrible decisions. Yeah, he said finally. More than one. It's not something you ever forget, or something you do lightly. I think about Marcus Whitman sometimes. Not with regret, he got what he deserved, but wondering if I could do it again if I had to. I hope you never have to find out. But even as Jacob said the words, he knew they were probably facing exactly that situation. Judge Whitman's influence was too great, the bounty too substantial for Ruby Mae's hunters to simply give up. Spring would bring men willing to kill for money, and Jacob was grimly determined to be ready for them. 3 nights before the new moon, Jacob was awakened by Thunder's nervous whickering from the corral. The big mare was standing alert, ears pricked toward the main trail, nostrils flaring as she tested the air for unfamiliar scents. Jacob slipped from his bed and moved to the window, studying the moonlit landscape for signs of movement. Nothing was visible, but Thunder's senses were sharper than his own. Something was out there. Jacob. Ruby Mae's voice drifted down from the loft. What is it? Someone's coming. Maybe still miles away, but Thunder smells them. Ruby Mae descended the ladder quickly, already reaching for her clothes. How long do we have? Hard to say. Could be hours, could be dawn. They dressed rapidly and began implementing the defensive plan they'd rehearsed dozens of times. Ruby Mae gathered their emergency supplies while Jacob checked their weapons and ammunition. Everything moved with practiced efficiency born of weeks of preparation. Are you ready for this? Jacob asked as they took their positions at opposite windows, rifles loaded and ready. Ruby Mae's answer was steady, without a trace of the fear he knew she must be feeling. I've been ready since the day I hit Marcus Whitman with that candlestick. The only difference is, now I'm not facing it alone, Jacob. felt a surge of pride and love for this remarkable woman who had transformed from a frightened fugitive into a warrior willing to fight for their future together. Whatever came with the dawn, they would meet it side by side. In the distance, thunder whinnied again, and Belle answered nervously. The horses could sense approaching danger, and their anxiety carried clearly on the still mountain air. Jacob checked his rifle one final time and settled in to wait. The battle for their sanctuary was about to begin. The cabin door had always been more than mere wood and iron hinges to Jacob. It represented the boundary between sanctuary and the dangerous world beyond. He'd hung it himself during his first autumn in the valley, crafting it from thick pine planks and reinforcing it with iron strapping salvaged from an abandoned mine. For 15 years it had kept out wind, weather, and unwelcome visitors. Now, as the first grey light of dawn crept across the mountains, that door stood as the final barrier between safety and the men who had come to claim Ruby Mae. They appeared just as the sun crested the eastern peaks, 3 riders moving slowly up the main trail, their horses picking their way carefully through the remaining patches of snow and ice. Jacob watched them through the cabin's single window, noting their deliberate approach. The way they spread out to cover different angles of approach to his property. Professional bounty hunters, he murmured to Ruby Mae, who was positioned at the cabin's rear window with his spare rifle. They know what they're doing. How can you tell? The way they're moving. No rush, no dramatic posturing. They're treating this like a job, not an adventure. Jacob studied the men through his spyglass, cataloguing details that might matter in the confrontation to come. The leader was a tall, lean man with graying hair and the weathered look of someone who spent his life outdoors. His companions were younger, but moved with the same careful competence. All 3 were heavily armed with rifles and pistols, and they rode horses that looked fresh and well-fed, despite the difficult mountain journey. Expensive operation, Jacob observed. Someone paid good money to send quality men after you. Thomas Whitman has deep pockets when it comes to protecting his reputation, Ruby Mae replied grimly. The riders halted about 200 yards from the cabin, just outside effective rifle range. Jacob watched as the leader dismounted and pulled something from his saddlebags, a spyglass of his own. The man spent several minutes studying the cabin, the corral, the surrounding terrain. He was making the same tactical assessment Jacob had hoped to avoid. They're not going to rush in blindly, Jacob said. The leader knows his business. What do? We wait. Let them make the first move and reveal their intentions. The waiting stretched out like a taut wire. Jacob could feel Ruby Mae's tension from across the cabin, could hear the slight change in her breathing that spoke of nerves held rigidly in check. For his part, Jacob felt the strange calm that had always come over him before combat, a slowing of time, a sharpening of focus that made every detail vivid and important. Finally, the lead bounty hunter remounted his horse and rode forward alone, stopping just within shouting distance of the cabin. He was older than Jacob had initially thought, perhaps 50, with steel-grey hair and pale eyes that missed nothing. Jacob Stone. The man called out, his voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. My name is Coleman Pike. I represent certain interests in Denver, and I believe you have something that belongs to them. Jacob moved to the door but didn't open it. My property belongs to me, Pike. You're trespassing. I'm talking about the woman, Stone, Ruby Sinclair. There's a substantial reward for her return to Denver to face justice for murder. Don't know anyone by that name. Pike's laugh was without humor. Don't insult my intelligence. We tracked her here. We know she's been staying in your cabin. Hand her over and we'll be on our way. No one needs to get hurt. And if I refuse, then we'll take her anyway, and you'll likely get hurt in the process. $500 is serious money, Stone. Serious enough to justify serious measures. Jacob felt Ruby Mae's presence behind him, could sense her listening to every word of the exchange. He thought about the months they'd spent together, the love that had grown between them, the future they'd begun to imagine. All of it came down to this moment, this choice between safety and standing up for what was right. Pike, Jacob called back. You seem like a reasonable man. Let me make you a counteroffer. I'm listening. Ride away now, and I won't kill you." The silence that followed was pregnant with implications. Pike sat motionless on his horse for a long moment, then turned and rode back to where his companions waited. Jacob watched through his spyglass as the three men held a brief conference, their gestures indicating heated disagreement about tactics. "What are they doing?" Ruby Mae asked, deciding whether I'm bluffing. "Pike knows this terrain gives me the advantage, but his employers won't be happy if he returns empty-handed." The conference ended with Pike issuing sharp orders to his men. They dismounted and began unloading equipment from their pack horses, rope, tools, and what looked like dynamite. "They're planning a siege," Jacob realized with growing alarm. "Pike's too smart to assault a defended position directly. He's going to try to force us out. How? Fire, probably. Or try to bring down part of the cabin with explosives." Ruby Mae was quiet for a moment, then asked the question Jacob had been dreading. "What are our chances?" Jacob considered their situation with the brutal honesty that survival demanded. Three experienced men with unlimited ammunition and explosives against two defenders in a fixed position with limited supplies. The odds were not encouraging. "If we stay here, they'll eventually find a way to flush us out," he said. "But if we leave the cabin, we lose our defensive advantage. Then what do we do?" Jacob looked around the cabin that had been his sanctuary for 15 years, taking in the handmade furniture, the carefully arranged possessions, the accumulated evidence of a life built in solitude. All of it was about to be destroyed or abandoned. "We make them pay such a high price for their success that they'll think twice about finishing the job," he said finally. Ruby Mae nodded, understanding the implications. They were going to fight, even knowing the odds were against them. "Better to die standing up than to live on their knees." "Jacob," she said quietly, "whatever happens, I want you to know." "Save it," he interrupted gently. "We're not finished yet." Outside, Pike and his men had finished their preparations. Jacob watched as they split up, one man moving toward the corral, where Thunder and Bell waited nervously, another circling toward the back of the cabin. Pike himself remained in front, rifle ready, coordinating the assault. "They're making their move," Jacob said, taking final aim through the window. "Remember what I taught you about combat shooting? Don't think, just react." The first shot came from behind the cabin as Pike's man attempted to set fire to the roof. Ruby Mae's rifle answered immediately, and Jacob heard a cry of pain followed by cursing. First blood to the defenders. Pike's response was swift and professional. He laid down covering fire, while his remaining companion rushed the front of the cabin. Jacob's shot took the man in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him scrambling for cover behind the woodpile. "Two down. One still fighting," Jacob reported, working the lever of his rifle to chamber another round. But even as he spoke, Jacob knew this was only the beginning. Pike was too experienced to be discouraged by early casualties. The real fight was just starting, and the outcome was far from certain. Ruby's locket caught the morning light as she moved from window to window, the silver pendant swaying with each quick step as she tracked Pike's movements through her rifle sight. The locket had been her mother's, containing a small photograph of her parents on their wedding day, two young people full of hope for a future that would prove far harsher than they'd imagined. Now it represented everything Ruby Mae was fighting to protect: love, hope, and the chance to build something beautiful despite the world's cruelty. Pike had proven himself a formidable adversary. After his initial assault failed, he'd settled into a patient siege, using the wounded man behind the woodpile as bait while he maneuvered for a better position. Jacob had been forced to split his attention between the front windows and Pike's attempts to circle around to the cabin's vulnerable sides. "He's good," Jacob admitted grimly as another of Pike's shots splintered the window frame inches from his head. "Better than I expected." Ruby Mae fired at a shadow moving between the trees, earning a curse from their hidden adversary. "How long can we hold them off?" "As long as our ammunition lasts." "But Pike knows that too. He's trying to make us waste shots." The battle had been raging for over an hour, a deadly game of cat and mouse that tested both sides' patience and marksmanship. Jacob's military training served him well, allowing him to anticipate Pike's tactics and counter most of his attempts to gain advantage. But Ruby Mae was the revelation. Her steady nerves and growing accuracy with the rifle made her a genuine threat to their attackers. Movement at the corral. Ruby Mae reported from her position at the rear window. "The wounded one is trying to spook the horses," Jacob cursed under his breath. Thunder and Bell represented their only chance of escape if the cabin became untenable. Losing the horses would trap them completely. "Can you get a clear shot?" "Not without exposing myself." "He's using the horses as cover." The tactical situation was deteriorating. Pike had wounded one of his own men to create a diversion, but that man was still mobile enough to threaten their escape route. Meanwhile, Pike himself continued his methodical approach toward the cabin's weak points. Then Ruby Mae made a decision that changed everything. "Cover me," she said, moving toward the cabin door with sudden determination. "Ruby, no! Stay in position!" But she was already moving, slipping out the door with fluid grace and disappearing around the corner of the cabin before Jacob could stop her. He heard the rapid crack of rifle fire, Pike's angry shouts, and then a scream of pain from the direction of the corral. Jacob's heart stopped as silence fell over the valley. Had Ruby Mae been hit? Was she lying wounded or dead behind the cabin while he sat helplessly at his window? "Ruby!" he called out, abandoning tactical silence for the desperate need to know she was safe. "I'm here!" Her voice came from an unexpected direction, the rocky outcropping that overlooked the main trail. "The one at the corral won't be bothering us anymore." Jacob felt a surge of relief and admiration. Ruby Mae had used Pike's focus on the frontal assault to circle around and eliminate the threat to their horses. It was a bold move that showed real tactical thinking, but Pike wasn't finished. The loss of his second man seemed to enrage rather than discourage him, and his next assault came with desperate fury. He charged the cabin directly, firing rapidly and depending on speed to carry him through Jacob's defensive fire. Jacob's first shot missed, his second caught Pike in the leg but didn't stop him. The bounty hunter slammed into the cabin door with his shoulder, and Jacob heard the wooden bar that secured it beginning to crack under the impact. "The door won't hold." Jacob shouted to Ruby Mae, wherever she was positioned. Pike's third impact shattered the bar completely, and the door swung open to reveal the bounty hunter framed in the doorway, rifle raised and ready to fire. Jacob had a split second to appreciate the man's professional courage before survival instincts took over. The two men fired simultaneously. Pike's shot went wide, thrown off by the pain in his wounded leg. Jacob's shot took Pike's center mass, sending the bounty hunter stumbling backward out of the doorway. But Pike wasn't finished. Even mortally wounded, he managed to raise his rifle for one final shot. Jacob saw death coming and knew he couldn't dodge in time. The shot that saved his life came from the rocky outcropping where Ruby Mae had positioned herself. Her bullet took Pike in the head, ending the threat permanently and sending the bounty hunter crashing to the ground in front of the cabin. Silence fell over the valley like a blanket. Jacob remained frozen for a long moment, hardly believing the fight was over. Then Ruby Mae's voice broke the spell. "Jacob! Are you hurt?" He stumbled to the doorway and saw her climbing down from the rocks, rifle still in her hands, her face pale but determined. The sight of her alive and unhurt was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. "I'm fine," he called back, though his hands were shaking with delayed reaction. "Are you?" Instead of answering, Ruby Mae ran to him, and Jacob caught her in his arms as she reached the cabin. They held each other tightly, both trembling with the aftermath of violence and the relief of survival. "It's over," Ruby Mae whispered against his chest. "They're all dead." Jacob looked around the valley that had been their sanctuary, now marked by violence and death. Pike's body lay sprawled near the door, and he could see the other two bounty hunters motionless in their final positions. The price of their freedom had been paid in blood. "For now," Jacob said quietly. "But Judge Whitman will send others when these three don't return." Ruby Mae pulled back to look at his face, her green eyes fierce with determination. "Then we'll face them too, together." Jacob studied her face. Seeing not the frightened fugitive who had arrived at his cabin months ago, but a woman who had found her strength and was prepared to fight for their future. The silver locket at her throat caught the light, a symbol of love surviving against impossible odds. Together, he agreed, and kissed her with all the passion and relief and desperate love that had carried them through their darkest hour. Outside, the mountain wind began to clear the smoke from their battle, and somewhere in the distance, thunder and bell whinnied softly in the morning sun. Their sanctuary had been tested and proven strong enough to protect what mattered most, not just their lives, but their love for each other. 2 wedding rings lay side by side on the rough wooden table that had witnessed so many of their evening conversations. Jacob's original ring, the one he'd carried in his shirt pocket for 15 years like a talisman of lost love, now rested beside a new band he'd crafted himself from a gold coin found in Pike's belongings. The transformation was complete, from symbols of ending to promises of beginning. Spring had arrived in earnest since the battle with Pike and his men. The snow had retreated to the highest peaks. Wildflowers painted the valley floor in brilliant colors, and the creek sang with snowmelt rushing toward the distant plains. But more than the season had changed in their mountain sanctuary. Ruby Mae stood at the cabin's window, no longer watching for threats, but simply enjoying the morning light as it fell across the transformed landscape. The wanted poster that had once seemed like a death sentence now lay crumpled in the fire pit, reduced to ash, along with Pike's personal effects. Jacob had searched the dead bounty hunters thoroughly, finding not only Judge Whitman's money, but correspondence that revealed the corrupt judge's desperation to silence Ruby Mae permanently. "The letters change everything," Jacob said, handling the papers with careful reverence. "Pike was supposed to make sure you never reached Denver alive. This isn't about bringing you to trial, it's about murder." Ruby Mae took the letters, reading through them with growing amazement. "Thomas Whitman ordered my death, in writing. These papers could destroy him. They could do more than that. They could clear your name completely." Over the weeks that followed their victory, Jacob and Ruby Mae had debated their next move extensively. The evidence they'd recovered proved Judge Whitman's corruption and his brother's innocence of the charges against her. But presenting that evidence would require leaving their mountain sanctuary and venturing back into a world that had shown them little kindness. "We could stay here," Ruby Mae had suggested during one of their long discussions. "Ignore the outside world completely and build our life in this valley." "We could," Jacob had agreed. "But you'd always be looking over your shoulder, wondering if the next stranger might recognize you. That's no way to live." The decision to act had come when they discovered among Pike's effects a commission from the Territorial Marshal's office, authorizing him to bring Ruby Mae back dead or alive. The document was signed by officials who clearly knew the truth about Judge Whitman's orders. "There are honest lawmen who need to see this evidence," Jacob had concluded. "People who can make sure justice is actually served this time." Their journey to Denver had taken 3 weeks, traveling carefully and avoiding main roads where possible. Jacob's knowledge of wilderness routes served them well, allowing them to reach the territorial capital without encountering anyone who might recognize Ruby Mae from the wanted posters. The confrontation with territorial authorities had been everything they'd hoped for, and more. Judge Thomas Whitman's corruption was exposed, his illegal bounty on Ruby Mae's head was revoked, and the charges against her were dismissed when the truth about Marcus Whitman's attack came to light. The judge himself faced federal charges for abuse of office and conspiracy to commit murder. "Miss Sinclair," the territorial marshal had said as he handed Ruby Mae an official document clearing her name, "I apologize for the injustice you've suffered. The territory failed you, and I'm sorry it took so long to make things right." But the legal victory, satisfying as it was, paled beside the personal triumph they'd achieved. Standing in the marshal's office as free citizens, Jacob and Ruby Mae had looked at each other and realized they could go anywhere, do anything, build whatever life they chose together. "Where do you want to live?" Jacob had asked as they'd walked out of the courthouse into the Denver sunlight. "With you," Ruby Mae had replied simply. Wherever that might be, they'd returned to the mountain cabin not as fugitives seeking shelter, but as two people who had found their home. The valley that had once represented Jacob's exile from the world had become something else entirely, a place where love had conquered fear, where two wounded souls had healed each other, where the future stretched ahead bright with possibility. Now, as autumn painted the aspens gold and the first light snows dusted the high peaks, Jacob held Ruby Mae's hand as they stood before the simple altar he'd built behind the cabin. The ceremony was witnessed only by thunder and bell, the wind, through the pines and the vast mountain sky that had sheltered their love through its darkest trials. I, Jacob Stone, take you, Ruby Mae Sinclair, to be my wife, he said, his voice steady despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. In sickness and health, in danger and safety, for as long as we both shall live. I, Ruby Mae Sinclair, take you, Jacob Stone, to be my husband, she replied, her green eyes bright with tears of joy. To love and cherish, to stand beside through whatever storms may come for all the days of our lives. They exchanged the rings with hands that had held weapons in defense of their love, that had worked together to survive impossible odds, that now trembled with the simple joy of promises freely given and gladly received. As Jacob kissed his bride in the golden light of their mountain sanctuary, he thought about the strange journey that had brought them together. A poker game, a blizzard, months of forced proximity that had slowly transformed into the deepest love either had ever known. Ruby Mae had taught him that isolation wasn't protection. It was simply another form of prison. Together, they'd learned that some things were worth fighting for, worth risking everything to protect. The cabin that had once housed a hermit's solitary existence now rang with laughter, conversation, and the countless small sounds of a shared life. Ruby Mae's sewing kit continued to work its magic, transforming their simple home into something beautiful. Jacob's skills as a provider and protector had found their true purpose in caring for the woman he loved. Do you ever regret it, Ruby? Mae asked one evening as they sat by the fire, her head resting on his shoulder. Giving up your solitude for all this complication? Jacob looked around their transformed cabin, thought about the legal battles they'd fought and won, the future they were building together in this high mountain valley. The only thing I regret, he said, pulling her closer, is that it took me 15 years to learn that the best things in life are worth a little complication. Outside, the wind sang through the pines as it had for countless years before their arrival, and would for countless years after they were gone. But inside their cabin, two people who had found each other against impossible odds settled into the contentment that comes from knowing they were exactly where they belonged, together, in love, and free to face whatever the future might bring. The mountain man was no longer alone, and the beautiful woman from the gentleman's saloon had finally found the home she'd never dared to dream of. Their 2 years of forced proximity had become the foundation of a lifetime of chosen companionship, proving that sometimes the best things in life come disguised as the worst, and that love really can conquer all.